I have to go to bed. I need to go to bed. No, okay, I'm not going to tell you how prepared we are for this because it'll, you know. So, welcome back. We are MCtheProfessor.GOV, aka the MCtheProfessor.GOV project, which is something I'm trying on. And we're here at lecture number 2 in our series. And this lecture is called Civil War Memory, Contestations of the Past, and Politics Today. Okay, first of all, historical memory. Anyone who has taken college history classes in the last 15 years probably knows what this is already, but if you haven't, let me just, you know, clue you in. This definition is not like 100% accurate, but let's just go with it. Historical memory is something like the version of history generally held to be true by the public. It's not so much what happened, it's what people remember happened. It's what people have, you know, you feel like it was like this. That's historical memory. When you ask someone who's never studied history about something they know nothing about and they have an answer for you, that's historical memory. See what I'm saying? Right? Ask just a person, oh yeah, what was like the French Revolution about? Whatever they say, that's historical memory, okay? That's what we're talking about. So, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Y'all know the basic story, right? North-South, Confederacy and the Union. We all know this. Abraham Lincoln, right? President Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, all this stuff. We're familiar. Gettysburg, right? Pennsylvania. I went to a diner there once. We all know, but so the basic story of the Civil War is something we're all familiar with, I would assume, right? Hell yeah. The American Civil War is the pivot point of American history. In fact, going back to the subject of the American History Survey, the National History Survey, if you look at the high school and college curriculums in any school today, you will find that the dividing point between the early and the modern American history choruses is either the Civil War or Reconstruction, which is essentially an extension of the Civil War. So this is the pivot point into which we get modern America, right? It's when we go from the America of the Revolution, right, and sectionalism and slave-holding republic and all of these things into the, you know, modern industrial capitalist society of today. That's the idea, is that this is the dividing point, and we're supposed to appreciate it for that reason. But the problem with that explanation is that the popular memory of the Civil War has a number of issues attached to it, which we are going to explore. Okay. Who can tell me what this is? Don't give me the wrong answer. No, first give me the wrong answer. What is it? Yeah, it's the CSA flag. No, of course. This we know is the war flag of Missouri. Oh, yeah. But specifically, it's the Army of Northern Virginia flag, right? So this is one of the battle flags of the Confederate States, but it's sort of become associated with the Confederacy in general, so this is sort of, you know, this is the Dixie flag and whatever. And you've all seen this before because this is a popularly used symbol, right? It's not just a flag, it is a symbol. It means something. And more to the point, it means different things to different people, right? Depending on who you ask, this means radically different things. Check this out. There's been a lot of kerfuffles in the last few years about the Confederate flag, and out of this we've got a lot of public discourse about the Confederate flag, and here are some of the things people had to say. Who knows the band Leonard Skinnerd, right? Famous for using the Confederate flag in the 70s in all their shows, and then also recently in all their shows. And then in 2012 they stopped using the flag in the shows because people complained and they took it away, and then a few weeks later their other fans complained, so they brought it back. And in an interview when they brought it back, Gary Rossington said this: "Through the years, people like the KKK and skinheads kind of kidnapped the Dixie or rebel flag from the Southern tradition and the heritage of the soldiers, you know. That's what it was about." He later said, "We know what the Dixie flag represents and its heritage. The Civil War was fought over states' rights. This is an argument I am sure you are familiar with. We are going to ignore one thing, which of course is that the Klan was formed in 1886 by 6 Confederate veterans." So I don't know what he's talking about. Judas. Anyway, but the point is, this person believes very sincerely in this story that the Civil War, from the Confederacy standpoint, was fought over this issue of states' rights. This is an individual liberties, anti-federal issue. Roberto Ferdman of the Washington Post. So the previous one, this was 2012. Here's 2015. "It's a reflection of the great treason of the South in the 19th century and its secession from the Union in defense of slavery. Ta-Nehisi Coates of the Atlantic said the Confederate flag is directly tied to the Confederate cause, and the Confederate cause was white supremacy." Okay, they are talking about the same thing. They are talking about a symbol. One of them says it is a symbol for states' rights. One says it is a symbol for white supremacy and a defense of slavery. Can both of these people be right? And more importantly, what is it actually that they are disagreeing about? What is the central thing that they are disagreeing about? It's the cause of the war, right? They're arguing about history through the symbolism of the flag. Some questions to consider about this, right? How might these different historical interpretations influence one's opinion about the significance of the flag today? If you are drawing on a particular history of the Civil War and it leads you to believe the flag means X, right? How is that going to influence your political ideology today? How is that going to influence your worldview, right? And if you think that the flag means Y, how is that going to influence your worldview, your politics, your social philosophy? So why are we talking about this? Here's the skinny, okay? Contestations of history define social and political divisions today. What I mean by that is you have a divided society, and it's not just divided in the present, it is divided in the past that it emerges out of. Every person who makes a political argument in America sees themselves as carrying on some legacy of the past. Second Amendment rights advocates see themselves as carrying the torch of the Founding Fathers. People who believe that the Confederate flag represents states' rights see themselves carrying the torch of a previous generation's struggle, and they see their previous struggle renewed in the present. And the thing is that everybody does this. All of our political disagreements are also historical disagreements. They are tied together. And this means that studying history can show us how we address these divisions. Because at the end of the day, there will not be peace in America until people all agree what the Civil War was about. I once yelled at my dad about that over pina coladas, and I think it made everybody uncomfortable. let's talk about historiography. Again, anyone who has taken a history class at the college level in the last 15 years knows what this word means, but let's just clarify for those of you who haven't. Historiography is basically the study of history. This is when historians look at what other historians in the past have written about other things in history in the past over time. So for example, Civil War historiography is the study of how historians have written about the Civil War since the Civil War. How did people write about the Civil War in the 30s and in the 50s and in the 80s and today? And how was it different? That's historiography. And while there's a lot of things that go into that, one element of this is it's kind of a genealogy of historical memory. You kind of get a little bit of this development whereby one school of thought prevails for a number of decades, influences a generation of people, and then falls by the wayside and is replaced by another narrative, which influences a new generation, right? Not always so neat. But delving into the historiography of the Civil War will give us a chance to talk a little bit more about the memory of the war. So let's do that. This is going to get real messy. The Civil War has been over since it's been over, but has the history of the Civil War changed over time? Yes. Yes, it has. Dramatically so. The things that historians, prominent historians, have written about the war has changed dramatically since the war happened. I want to walk you through some of those changes. When the war ended, two narratives emerged, obvious. Clearly, there was a northern narrative and there was a southern narrative. The northern narrative looked upon Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, the savior of the Union, as sort of a godly figure. I mean, saved the Union. This is the story that means that Lincoln's going to get #1 on all the best presidents lists forever, right? That's because of this. This is the northern story of the war. Lincoln, the god figure who saves the Union. But there was another story also. In the South, almost immediately after the war was over, Southern historians began writing their own version. Of the war, which school of thought came to be known as the lost cause of the Confederacy. Lost cause. The Lost Cause is a Southern white man's narrative of the war. Right? This is the story of the war from the perspective of those who lost. And what is fascinating about this is there is sort of a conventional wisdom that those who win get to write the history. Not always the case. Sometimes the people who lose write the history. Because while Lost Cause historians remained obscure for a while, the Lost Cause narrative of the war eventually took hold all around the country, and by the mid-20th century, or the early mid-20th century, was the prevailing narration of the war. So what is this? The Lost Cause has 4 basic elements, and people can, you can add on your own little bits and pieces as you please, but here's the basic ones. The first one is the South didn't actually lose the war. It didn't actually lose. They were overwhelmed by the North, right? There was just too many Northerners. They had too much money, right? All these people and all this industry, and they just overran the South. Sort of like how the United States didn't lose in Vietnam. We just got overwhelmed all the way out of Vietnam. You see, I mean, as you laugh, that's what it is, though, right? Like, if you ask today people of a certain age whether or not the United States succeeded in Vietnam, people won't say we lost the war. Southerners, right after the war, did not admit defeat in this way. It was about being overwhelmed. The other thing about this was a cultural piece. This idea that Southern men were better. were more genteel, were more culturally refined, and were more noble than were Northerners. That they were better people. That they were the ones who preserved the true American culture. That the plantation class, which was destroyed by the Civil War, or which morphed after the Civil War, represented the best of America. Right? The other element of the lost cause narrative is that the Civil War was about states' rights and that slavery was a mere side issue. Individual liberty was the most important thing, right? This was about opposition to federal government oppression and the autonomy of state governments. And finally, lost cause historians posited that slavery was a benevolent institution. I don't have to tell you the reasons why this is incorrect, but I can show you the ways that this perspective came to prevail in the early part of the 20th century. Who's ever seen Gone with the Wind? Gone with the Wind, one of the most popular American movies of all time, right, quite famous and beloved, begins with this. This is how it opens. There was a land of cavaliers and cotton fields called the Old South. Here in this pretty world, gallantry took its last bow. Here was the last ever to be seen of knights and their ladies fair, of master and of slave. Look for it only in books, for it is no more than a dream remembered, a civilization gone with the wind. Gone with the Wind is a lost cause story of the war. Watch the way that slavery is depicted in Gone with the Wind. Enslaved people are comic relief in Gone with the Wind. And all the central elements of the lost cause narrative prevail through the story of Gone with the Wind, which is very much a 20th century product. It might seem strange. How else? You know what Memorial Day is? When's Memorial Day? Anyone know? It used to be May 30th. Now it's like the end of May. Memorial Day used to be called Decoration Day. It was originally called Decoration Day. It was a day for the decoration of the graves of Union soldiers, and eventually it morphs into Memorial Day, where it's a general memorial for sort of all people. We saw a lot of memorializing of the dead, both in North and South, and they tended to be separate things for a long time. There were some people that decorated the graves of both groups of soldiers, but for the most part, it was separated. Until the 20th century, and in 1913 there was a 50th anniversary celebration of the Battle of Gettysburg, where all of the living veterans of the battle returned to the battlefield, all old and gray, right? It's called the Blue and Gray Reunion. And they all got together in their uniforms, and the president, Woodrow Wilson, famous racist, said this: "How wholesome and healing the peace has been. We have found one another again as brothers and comrades in arms, enemies no longer, generous friends rather, our battles long past, the quarrel forgotten, except that we shall not forget the splendid valor, the manly devotion of the men that arrayed against one another. Now grasping hands and smiling into each other's eyes, how complete the union has become. And how dear to all of us, how unquestioned, how benign and majestic, as state after state has been added to this great family of free men," said the man who resegregated Washington, D.C. And 2 years later, this has gotten a little, 2 years later, Birth of a Nation. First film ever shown in the White House, 1915. Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, which includes the line, "The former enemies of North and South are united again in common defense of their Aryan birthright." A story of how the Ku Klux Klan saves families from rampaging black veterans. a movie which depicts the Reconstruction governments wherein over 600 black people managed to get into the legislatures of the South during Reconstruction. This movie depicts white men in blackface in a replica of the South Carolina legislature, waving around turkey legs and swigging gin and not wearing shoes and general buffoonery. White men in blackface caricaturing the black legislators and making Reconstruction out to be a horrendous failure. So what was happening? Have you ever wondered about Confederate monuments and wondered who built those and when? You will find, if you look at all the Confederate monuments in the United States, the majority were built in the first half of the 20th century, most in the 19-teens, around the time of this. And what we saw happening was that in the early 20th century, as the generation that fought the Civil War aged, and as Jim Crow set in, right? 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson, right? As the remnants of Reconstruction faded away, as all the enfranchised black men in America began to lose their right to vote, as the NAACP emerges in the 19-teens in a desperate attempt to fight back against the rising tide of white supremacy, people began to remember the Civil War, and North and South began to remember the common cause of white supremacy, and united in their memory of the war to reinforce white supremacy at the expense of black people. William Archibald Dunning was a Columbia historian. Pictures are swapped. It's the man from the previous photo, previous slide. He was a professor at Columbia University, a historian who had a whole bunch of doctoral candidates. He wrote a whole bunch of books all throughout the first 30 years of the 20th century and became the most influential Reconstruction and Civil War historian of his day. He commanded not only the historical memory of the public, but also the historical narrative among scholars. And he reinforces the lost cause narrative. If you took a history class at Columbia University or anywhere else in the 19-teens and 1920s, what you learned was that Birth of a Nation was accurate. What you learned was that Reconstruction was a failure, that black legislators ruined the South. And it was not until William Edward Burghardt Du Bois of Massachusetts, the already at this time aging scholar, wrote a book in 1935 called Black Reconstruction, where he told what is now essentially the accepted 2018 version of the Civil War, where he centers black agency, where he realizes that the only reason why the Emancipation Proclamation worked and why it came when it did was that there was already a massive tide of enslaved people who were escaping from the South into the North in what Du Bois called essentially a general strike, considering it to be a labor, sort of element of labor, obviously. And he makes this revolutionary leftist interpretation, and nobody cares. Nobody reads him. It's difficult for him to find work. Dunning prevails until two other historians, Beard and Beale, come along and eventually alter the narrative slightly. But it really takes until the last few decades for Du Bois's 1935 interpretation to have any kind of serious scholarly weight. And all the while the monuments go up. This one is in Alabama. Interestingly enough, the stone figurines are made of Quincy granite from right here in Massachusetts. And of course, if we follow this through even further, into the 1950s and 1960s, what do we find? As the civil rights movement begins to explode onto the public scene in the 1950s, what reemerges in opposition? Massive resistance, the Southern movement to resist the civil rights movement, and the iconography of the Confederacy returns again. And here we begin seeing the Confederate flag show up all over the South and the North as a not-so-subtle symbol of white supremacy. While historians begin telling this other story about how actually the real baddies were the Northern industrialists, they still treat all the black players in history as pawns. Don't take seriously black agency like Du Bois did 20 and 30 years prior. What of today? There were at least 3 large protests in 2017 in Charlottesville. And what were they about? Local government decided to take down the statue of Robert E. Lee, which, by the way, was unveiled in 1924, commissioned in 1917. You see? And what was the problem? These people said you can't take down the statue of Robert E. Lee, you're destroying the heritage of the South. I don't know what Gary Rossington of Leonard Skinner thought about this, but I can guess. And a lot has been said about this event, and I don't want to repeat, but I do want you to think about the extent to which this is an extension of a historical disagreement, and to also think about the depth of what that means. Because it turns out it's really hard to change somebody's mind about what all of history is about. That's not that easy. No matter how loud you yell. And it makes us wonder, what is the effective remedy for a world where people can't even agree on the fundamental cause of a 150-year-old war? That's bonkers. All of our social and political problems stem back to our persistent inability to agree and understand what this thing is, what this thing was, and to make use of it. Current U.S. Ambassador to the UN, then Governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley, signed a bill authorizing the removal of the Confederate flag from the State House grounds, where it had flown since when? 1961, in opposition to the Civil Rights Movement. It was not around before that. And why did she do that? Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 black parishioners in a Charleston church in 2015. And shortly thereafter, the flag came down. When she signed the bill, she gave one of each of the 9 pens she signed with to each of the families of somebody who lost a loved one. I want you to think about that. The bill that brought down the Confederate flag in 2015, the pens used to sign the bill are given to the families of black people murdered by an avowed white supremacist terrorist. Think about that. You couldn't ask for more complete symbolism and for more accurate symbolism for what this is all about. And it makes you wonder about symbolism, right? And it makes you wonder about the power of symbols and the role of symbols in our discursive universe. And it makes you wonder why you very often see these two things together. This is the Blue Lives Matter flag, which emerged in 2014 in direct opposition to the Black Lives Matter movement, in support of police officers, and of course, the old Confederate battle flag. States' rights, anti-establishment. You ever wondered why it was possible to have "I hate the government, but not the instruments of coercion. I don't like an invasive state, but I like the violent wing that enforces its rules"? What? What are you that doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you think about the history this is emerging out of, right? And this thing didn't come about in 2014. That is an old symbol, and we know what it is. So I would say to you, I don't really know what to do about this, because again, it's a lot of work to convince somebody that all of history is not what a person thinks all of history is. And I'm not even sure that's a winnable battle, or a worthwhile battle, or even an interesting conversation. But it should make us realize that when we think we have political arguments or political disagreements, it's much bigger than that. You're talking about worldview, which includes history. You're talking about an entire universe. And when two people disagree about what one of these things means, that is two different universes colliding. And it's not always that pretty. And what you do about that and how you move forward, I'm not sure. But unless we recognize the enormity of that task, we are gonna just feel good reading your think pieces, having one conversation with that uncle. Not gonna do it. Not gonna do it. I don't know what's gonna do it. If you sort it out, let me know. And don't forget, contestations of history define social and political divisions. So the study of history is absolutely necessary for us to address those divisions. Thank you very much.